I wasn't in Singapore, and the moment I heard the laughter from inside my house, I knew exactly how far the truth had drifted from what she believed. My name is Ethan Walker, 39 years old, senior systems engineer, the kind of man who built his life on schedules, precision, and quiet consistency. For the past 7 years, my job had taken me overseas more times than I could count: Singapore, Tokyo, Frankfurt, cities measured in flight hours and hotel receipts, not memories. Olivia used to joke that she could set her watch by my departures. Monday morning flights, Friday night returns, a rhythm so predictable it almost felt like a promise. I thought that predictability meant trust, that consistency was the same thing as stability. Looking back, I realized now it was something else entirely. It was distance. The kind that doesn't show up all at once, but seeps in through the cracks while you're busy believing everything is fine. 3 weeks ago, I noticed the first shift. Nothing dramatic, nothing you could point to and say, "That's it." Just small things. Olivia started locking her phone, something she'd never done before. Conversations became shorter, smoother, like rehearsed lines instead of real thoughts. When I told her about this latest trip to Singapore, she barely looked up from her coffee, just nodded and said, "Text me when you land." Like it was routine, like I was already gone. That was the moment something didn't sit right. Not suspicion. Not yet. Just a quiet weight in my chest that didn't belong there. So I did what I always do when something feels off. I paid attention. I watched the timing of her days, the way she moved through the house, the pauses between her words. Patterns tell you everything if you're willing to see them. And what I saw wasn't chaos. It was precision. The kind that doesn't happen by accident. That's when I made the decision. I booked the flight. Sent her the itinerary. Even packed my suitcase and left it by the door where she could see it. Monday morning, I kissed her goodbye, rolled that suitcase out to the driveway, and drove off like I had 100 times before. But I didn't go to the airport. I drove 20 miles south, checked into a business hotel off Route 9, and waited. Not for proof. For confirmation. Because deep down, I already knew. 3 days later, on a Thursday night, I sat in my car across the street from my own house, engine off, dashboard lights dim, watching the windows glow against the dark. It was just past 9 p.m. The kind of quiet suburban night where everything looks exactly the way it's supposed to. Lawns trimmed. Porch lights steady. Nothing out of place. Except there was a second car in my driveway. Black sedan. Not mine. Not hers. I watched it for a long time, longer than I needed to, like maybe if I stared hard enough it would disappear and take whatever truth it represented with it. It didn't. At 9:17, I saw movement inside. A shadow crossing the living room. Then another. And then I heard it. Faint at first, carried through the glass and the still air. Laughter. Not hers alone. That's when everything inside me went completely still. No anger. No panic. Just clarity. I stepped out of the car, closed the door without a sound, and walked up the driveway of the house I paid for, the house I thought I understood, each step steady, measured, like I'd rehearsed it. The front door wasn't locked. That detail didn't surprise me. I stepped inside, the familiar smell of home hitting me like something borrowed, something I no longer recognized. The lights were on in the living room, voices low now, closer, more contained. I didn't call out. Didn't announce myself. I followed the sound down the hallway, past the framed photos, past the life we built piece by piece, until I stood in front of the guest room door. The laughter stopped on the other side, replaced by a silence that felt heavier than anything I'd heard all night. I raised my hand, paused for exactly one breath, and knocked. The knock echoed softer than I expected, just 2 measured taps against the wood, but on the other side everything went completely still, the kind of silence that is not natural, not empty, but filled with people holding their breath and trying to decide what to do next, and in that pause I could feel it, the exact moment where whatever illusion had been living in that room started to crack. I kept my hand resting lightly against the door, not pushing, not forcing, just waiting, because I was not there to chase the truth anymore. I was there to let it come to me. Footsteps shifted inside, uneven, hurried but controlled, like someone trying to move quietly after already making too much noise, and then Olivia's voice came through, softer than usual, tight around the edges, asking, "Who is it?" She already knew. You can tell when someone is asking a question they do not want answered. I did not raise my voice. I did not move. I just said her name once, calm and steady. Olivia. The sound of it landed differently this time, heavier, like it carried something final inside it, and for a second there was nothing again, no movement, no sound, just the weight of recognition settling in. Then I heard another voice, lower, unfamiliar but confident, whispering something I could not make out, followed by the faint shuffle of fabric, the kind of rushed adjustment people make when they realize they have run out of time. The door did not open right away. It took a few seconds longer, long enough for the truth to fully form in my mind without needing to see it, long enough for me to understand that whatever was behind that door had been happening before tonight, that this was not a mistake, not a one-time lapse, but a pattern I had simply not been present to witness. When the handle finally turned, it moved slowly, carefully, like whoever was on the other side thought they could still control how this moment unfolded. The door opened just a few inches at first, then a little more, until Olivia stood there, framed by the soft light of the guest room, her expression caught somewhere between surprise and calculation, like she was already trying to decide which version of the truth she was going to offer me. She looked exactly the same as she had that morning when I left, same hair, same face, same person, and yet nothing about her felt familiar anymore. For a second, either of us spoke. I let my eyes take in the room without turning my head too much, just enough to register the details, the second glass on the nightstand, the jacket draped over the chair that did not belong to me, the presence of someone else just out of full view. I did not need more than that. She started to say something, my name, maybe an explanation, maybe a question, but I raised my hand slightly, not aggressively, just enough to stop the words before they formed, because I was not interested in hearing a version of the story that began tonight. My voice stayed even when I finally spoke. You thought I was in Singapore. It was not a question. It was a statement of fact, simple and precise. Her eyes shifted for a fraction of a second, not away from me completely, just enough to confirm everything I needed to know. Behind her, I could feel the other man's presence more than see it, a silhouette in the edge of the light, still, waiting, unsure of his place in a moment that did not belong to him. The air in the hallway felt different now, heavier, like the house itself was holding the tension between us. I took one step closer, not into the room, just enough to close the distance between where I stood and where she had chosen to stand, and in that space, everything became clear in a way it had not been before, not when I saw the car, not when I heard the laughter, but here, face to face, where there was no more distance left to hide behind. I looked at her, not searching for answers, not looking for guilt or regret, just seeing her as she was in this moment, and realized something that surprised me in its simplicity. I was not angry. Not the way people expect. What I felt was something colder, something more controlled. It was the understanding that whatever we had built no longer existed in the form I thought it did. And once you see that clearly, there is no going back to not knowing it. I let the silence stretch a little longer, not because I needed time to think, but because I knew she did, and the longer it lasted, the more it worked against her, because silence has a way of forcing the truth closer to the surface whether you want it there or not, and I could see it happening in real time in the way her posture shifted, the way her hand tightened slightly on the edge of the door like she needed something solid to hold on to. Ethan, I can explain, she finally said, her voice softer now, stripped of that earlier confidence, but still carrying that instinct to manage the situation, to shape it into something less than what it was, and for a moment I almost recognized the pattern, the same tone she used when smoothing over small arguments, when turning tension into something temporary, something fixable, but this was not that kind of moment. I shook my head once, slow and controlled, not dismissive, just final, and said, No, you cannot, because explanations only matter when the outcome is still undecided, and this one was not. Behind her, the man shifted, stepping slightly into view as if he had decided hiding was no longer an option, and now I could see him clearly, mid-30s maybe, well put together, the kind of man who looked comfortable in places that were not his expression caught somewhere between uncertainty and defiance, like he was trying to measure me, figure out how this would play out, but there was nothing for him to read in me. Nothing reactive, nothing emotional for him to push against. I gave him a brief glance, just enough to acknowledge his presence without giving him importance, and then my attention returned to Olivia, because this was never about him, not really. "How long?" I asked, my tone steady, not accusatory, just precise, like I was asking for a number I already expected to hear. She hesitated, and that hesitation said more than any answer could, because people only pause like that when the truth is bigger than they hoped it would be. "It is not what you think," she said instead, and that almost made me smile, not out of humor, but out of recognition, because that sentence appears when there is no better one available. I exhaled slowly, not frustrated, just done with the version of this conversation that tries to soften reality, and said, "It is exactly what I think," and let the words settle between us. The house felt different now, quieter in a way that had nothing to do with sound, like something fundamental had shifted and everything else was adjusting around it. I took another small step forward, still not crossing into the room, still holding that boundary, and for the first time I saw something real break through in her expression, not the practiced calm, not the controlled responses, but something closer to uncertainty, maybe even fear, not of me, but of what came next, of what this moment meant beyond itself. "You were not supposed to be here," she said, almost under her breath, like she was speaking more to the situation than to me, and that was the clearest statement she had made so far, because it revealed the structure behind everything, the assumption she had built this around, the certainty that I would be gone, that there would be no interruption, no consequence tonight. I nodded once, acknowledging that point without agreeing to anything else, and replied, "No, I was not," because she was right about that part, just not in the way she expected. I reached into my jacket pocket then, slow, deliberate, and pulled out my phone, holding it loosely in my hand, not as a threat, not as a weapon, just as something that belonged in this moment, and I watched her eyes track the movement, watched the understanding start to form even before I said anything else. "I have been back since Monday," I said, my voice still level, still controlled, and that landed harder than anything before it, because it rewrote the timeline she thought she was living in. It shifted the ground under her feet in a way that could not be adjusted or explained away. The man behind her straightened slightly at that, his confidence thinning, replaced by something more cautious, more aware, and for the first time since this started, the balance in the room changed, not dramatically, not with noise or force, but with something quieter, something more decisive. I looked at both of them now, taking in the full picture without needing to study it, and realized that the moment I thought would feel explosive, chaotic, overwhelming, felt none of those things. It felt resolved. Like a question that had already been answered before it was asked. I watched the realization settle across her face, not all at once, but in layers, like something unraveling thread by thread, and for the first time since I had stepped into the house, she did not look like she was in control of the narrative anymore. She looked like someone trying to catch up to a version of reality that had already moved past her. "Since Monday?" she repeated, her voice quieter now, less certain, as if saying the words out loud might change them, might reshape what they meant, but it did not, and we both knew it. I nodded once, not adding anything to it, because the statement was enough on its own. It did all the work it needed to do. The man behind her shifted again, this time more noticeably, stepping fully into the light of the room, and I could see the calculation in his expression change, the earlier confidence replaced by something more cautious, more aware of the position he was actually in, not the one he thought he was stepping into. "Look, man," he started, his tone measured, trying to find a neutral ground that did not exist. "I did not know." I raised my hand slightly again, the same controlled gesture as before, not aggressive, not dismissive, just enough to stop the sentence from continuing, because whatever he thought he did or did not know was not relevant to me, not in this moment. This is not a conversation you need to be part of, I said, my voice calm, even, leaving no room for interpretation, and he paused, caught between wanting to respond and understanding that there was no space for it, and after a second, he stepped back, not leaving, but retreating just enough to remove himself from the center of what was happening. Olivia watched that exchange closely, her eyes moving between us, and I could see something shift again, a subtle but important change, because for the first time she was not just reacting to me, she was recalibrating her understanding of the situation, realizing that whatever dynamic she had been operating under no longer applied. "Ethan, please," she said, stepping forward slightly, closing the distance I had kept so deliberate, her voice carrying a different tone now, not control, not explanation, but something closer to appeal, like she was reaching for a version of me that had already stepped out of this moment. "We need to talk about this." I held my position, not stepping back, not stepping forward, just steady, and looked at her for a long second before answering, because this was the point where most people lean into emotion, into confrontation, into trying to force a resolution through volume or intensity, but that was never how I handled things, and it was not going to start now. "We are talking," I said simply, because everything that mattered was already being said, just not in the way she expected. Her shoulders tightened slightly, frustration mixing with the uncertainty, and I could see the instinct to push harder, to demand more, to turn this into something louder, something she could navigate the way she always had, but there was nothing to push against, nothing reactive for her to work with, and that absence was doing more than any argument could. I let a few seconds pass, not out of hesitation, but intention, and then I continued. "I did not come here to ask questions." My tone steady, measured, each word placed carefully. "And I did not come here to hear explanations." That landed differently, heavier, because it removed the framework she was trying to build, the idea that this was still a conversation that could be shaped, adjusted, negotiated. Her eyes searched mine for something, anything that suggested there was still room to change the outcome, but there was nothing there for her to find, and I could see that realization settle in, slow but undeniable. I glanced once more into the room, taking in the details again without focusing on any one thing, the second presence, the disrupted space, the evidence of a reality that no longer included me in the way I thought it did, and then I brought my attention back to her. "I came here to end this," I said, not raising my voice, not adding emphasis, just stating it as plainly as everything else, because clarity does not need volume to be understood. The words hung in the air between us, simple, direct, and final, and for the first time, she did not respond right away, did not try to reshape them or soften them, because there are moments when language stops being something you can work around, and becomes something you have to face exactly as it is, and this was one of those moments. I could see the exact moment the weight of those words reached her, not just heard but understood, because there is a difference between hearing something and realizing what it actually means for your life. And Olivia stood there in that narrow space between the door and the hallway like someone who had just stepped into a version of reality she could not negotiate her way out of. "And this?" she repeated, quieter now, her voice losing that practiced edge, as if saying it out loud might somehow make it less final, but it only made it more real. I did not answer right away, not because I needed to think, but because I wanted the silence to do what it does best, to remove the last layer of denial, to let the truth settle without interference. Behind her, the man shifted again, this time with a different energy, less confident, more aware that whatever situation he thought he was stepping into had changed entirely, and I could see it in the way his posture adjusted, the way he no longer looked at me directly but instead glanced toward Olivia, as if waiting for her to regain control of something that was no longer hers to control. She took a step forward, closing the distance again, her hand lifting slightly like she was about to reach for me, then stopping halfway, uncertain, and in that hesitation I saw everything that had changed, not just tonight, but long before it. "You are overreacting," she said, but even as the words left her mouth, they did not carry conviction, they sounded like something pulled from habit rather than belief, and that alone told me she knew it would not land the way she wanted it to. I let out a slow breath, not frustrated, not angry, just clear, and said, "No, I am responding. Because there is a difference, and once you understand it, you stop confusing one for the other. Her expression tightened slightly, the realization pressing in from all sides now, and I could see the shift happening again, the move from denial to something closer to urgency. Because when someone realizes they cannot control the narrative, they try to regain it through speed, through emotion, through pushing the moment forward before it settles. "Ethan, listen to me," she said, faster now, her words coming in a stream that felt less constructed, more reactive. "This is not what it looks like. We were just talking, it got late, and—" I shook my head once, calm, controlled, and that was enough to stop her again, because the truth does not need to argue with explanations that do not hold up under their own weight. "You do not need to explain what I can already see," I said, my voice steady, not louder, not sharper, just precise, and I watched as that landed, as it removed the last place she could retreat to, the idea that this could still be reframed into something less than it was. The hallway felt smaller now, not physically, but in the way the space between us carried everything that had been said and everything that had not, and for a moment, no one spoke, not her, not the man behind her, not me, because there was nothing left that needed to be filled with noise. I shifted my weight slightly, not moving closer, not stepping away, just grounding myself in the moment, and then I continued. "I have already spoken to an attorney." And that changed the room in a way nothing else had, because it moved this out of the present moment and into the future, into consequences, into actions that had already begun before she even knew there was a problem. Her eyes widened slightly, just enough to show the impact, and for the first time since I had knocked on that door, she looked truly unprepared, not for what had happened, but for what came next. "You what?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper now, and I held her gaze as I answered. "Monday morning, after I checked into the hotel, I made the call. Because this was not something I decided in the hallway, not something driven by emotion, but something that had been set in motion the moment I stopped ignoring what was right in front of me." The man behind her straightened again at that, more alert now, more aware that this was not a situation he could simply step away from without consequence, and I could see the discomfort settle in, not dramatic, not loud, but present. Olivia looked between us again, then back at me, searching, recalculating, trying to find a version of this where she still had influence. But every path led back to the same place, the one I had already defined. "You cannot just decide that on your own," she said, grasping for something that sounded like control, something that implied shared authority. And I met that calmly, without hesitation, and said, "I already did." Because some decisions stop being shared the moment trust is no longer mutual, and once that line is crossed, there is no negotiation that brings it back. The words settled into the room like something irreversible, not loud, not dramatic, but final in a way that did not require repetition, and I watched as Olivia processed them, not all at once, but in fragments, like pieces of a structure she had relied on quietly collapsing beneath her. "You already did," she repeated, slower this time, as if testing the shape of it, trying to find a place where it could be challenged, but there was none, and we both knew it. She shook her head slightly, more to herself than to me, and I could see the shift again, the movement from resistance to something closer to realization, because there is a point where arguing stops making sense, and you are left with the consequences instead. "Ethan, this is not how this works," she said, but her voice lacked direction now, like she was speaking from a script that no longer matched the situation, and I let a brief pause pass before responding, not to delay, but to let the difference between what she believed and what was actually happening become clearer. "It is exactly how this works," I said, my tone even, not defensive, not confrontational, just grounded in the reality that had already been set in motion. Behind her, the man shifted again, more restless now, his earlier confidence gone entirely, replaced by a discomfort he could not quite hide, and for a moment he looked like he might say something, step in, try to redirect what was happening, but he did not, because there was nothing here for him to fix, nothing he could influence without making himself more involved in something that was already beyond his control. Olivia took another step forward, closer than before, her expression searching mine again, not for answers this time, but for hesitation, for any sign that this could still be slowed down, reshaped, undone. "We can figure this out," she said, and this time there was something real in her voice, not performance, not strategy, but a genuine attempt to reach backward, to hold on to something that had already slipped past the point of recovery. I looked at her for a long second, not unkindly, not with anger, but with a clarity that made everything simpler than it had been in weeks. "You are trying to fix something that you already broke," I said, and there was no accusation in it, just a statement of fact, because the moment that matters is not when something is discovered, it is when it happens, and that moment had already passed long before I stood in this hallway. She flinched slightly at that, not dramatically, just enough to show that it landed where it needed to, and for a second, she did not respond, did not reach for another explanation or another angle, because there are only so many ways to say the same thing before it stops carrying weight. The house felt quieter now, almost still, like everything had settled into its new shape, and I realized that the tension I expected to feel, the anger, the confrontation, had been replaced by something else entirely, something more controlled, more resolved. I shifted my gaze briefly toward the man behind her, acknowledging him again without giving him space to insert himself, and said, "You should leave." Not as a threat, not as a demand shouted in anger, but as a simple instruction, calm and direct, because his presence here no longer served any purpose. He hesitated for a fraction of a second, looking to Olivia as if waiting for her to object, to stop him, but she did not, her focus still locked on me, still trying to understand what was happening, and after that brief pause he nodded once, quietly, and stepped back, moving toward the edge of the room, gathering what belonged to him without urgency, without noise, like someone who understood that the moment did not belong to him, and never had. I did not watch him closely, did not follow his movement, because that part of the situation was already resolved in my mind, and instead I kept my attention on Olivia, on the space between us, on the reality that now existed where something else used to be. When I heard the faint sound of the front door opening and closing a minute later, it did not feel like a victory or a loss, just a transition, one more piece of the situation moving into place. She exhaled slowly after that, the sound unsteady in a way I had not heard from her before, and for the first time, the room felt like it held only the two of us again, but not in the way it used to, not with familiarity or comfort, just with the quiet weight of what remained. The sound of the front door closing echoed faintly through the house, softer than I expected, but it carried a finality that settled into the walls like something permanent, and for a moment neither of us moved, either of us spoke, because what was left between us was not something that needed to be filled with words anymore, it was something that needed to be faced. Olivia stood there in the doorway of the guest room, her shoulders slightly tense, her breathing uneven in a way she was not used to showing, and I could see the shift in her clearly now, not the composed version she presented to the world, not the controlled partner I had lived with for years, but someone who was trying to understand how quickly everything had changed without her noticing. "Ethan," she said again, quieter this time, almost careful, like she was choosing each word before it left her mouth. "We cannot just throw everything away like this." I let that sit for a second, not because it needed an immediate response, but because it deserved to be heard fully before it was answered, and then I shook my head slightly, not dismissing her, but correcting the premise itself. "I am not throwing anything away," I said, my voice steady, calm, grounded in a clarity that had been building long before tonight. "I am accepting what is already gone." That landed differently, not sharp, not loud, but undeniable, because it reframed everything, not as a sudden decision, but as the recognition of something that had already happened without being acknowledged. She looked at me, really looked this time, as if trying to see if there was any hesitation behind the words, any crack in the certainty, but there was none, and I could see that realization settle in again, heavier now, harder to move past. She stepped out of the room fully then, closing the door behind her without looking back, creating a clean separation between what had just happened and what remained, and for a moment we stood facing each other in the hallway, the distance between us small but filled with everything that had changed. "So that is it?" she asked, her voice steadier now, but carrying something underneath it, something closer to disbelief than anger, like she was still trying to measure the scale of what was happening. I nodded once, not adding emphasis, not stretching it out, just confirming what had already been said. That is it, I replied, because sometimes the simplest answer is the only honest one left. She exhaled slowly, the sound controlled but not fully contained, and ran a hand through her hair, a small, familiar gesture that suddenly felt disconnected from everything else, like a piece of a different version of her that no longer fit into this moment. You are not even going to try? She said, and there was something in that question, not accusation exactly, but a challenge, as if effort itself could still change the outcome. I met her gaze without shifting, without softening, and answered, I did try. Because that part mattered, not as a defense, not as something I needed her to acknowledge, but as a truth that existed regardless of how this ended. The hallway felt narrower now, not physically, but emotionally, like there was less space for anything unnecessary, and I realized that what I felt was not relief, not satisfaction, but something quieter, something more grounded, the absence of confusion, the absence of doubt. You built a version of this where I was not here. I continued, my tone still even, still controlled. And now that I am, it does not work the same way anymore. She did not respond right away, and that silence felt different from the ones before, less defensive, more reflective, like she was finally looking at the situation without trying to reshape it. I took a small step back then, creating just a little more distance, not out of discomfort, but intention, because this was no longer a shared space in the way it used to be, and the physical distance matched what had already changed between us. I will be staying at the hotel for now, I said, simple, direct, outlining the next step without turning it into something larger than it needed to be, and she nodded faintly, almost automatically, like she understood that this part was no longer something she had input on. I glanced around the hallway one more time, the framed photos, the familiar layout, the life that had once felt stable and certain, and it did not feel like mine in the same way anymore, not broken, not destroyed, just no longer aligned with the reality I was standing in. When I looked back at her, there was nothing left that needed to be argued, nothing left that needed to be explained, just the quiet understanding of what this moment meant moving forward, and that was enough. I turned toward the front door without waiting for anything else from her, not to avoid more conversation but because nothing left could change what had already been decided, and staying would only create space for words that no longer mattered, each step down the hallway measured and deliberate, like moving through a place I recognized but no longer belonged to, the familiar details along the walls now distant rather than meaningful. And when I reached for my keys on the small table by the entrance, the same place I had used countless times before, the simplicity of that motion stood out more than anything else, a quiet reminder of how normal everything had seemed just days ago. Behind me I heard her footsteps, slower, more hesitant, following but never quite closing the distance, as if she wasn't sure how close she was allowed to come anymore. Ethan, wait, she said, her voice different this time, less controlled, less certain, caught somewhere between composure and something she couldn't quite define, and I paused with my hand on the door handle, not turning immediately, making it clear. This pause wasn't an invitation, just acknowledgement. What happens now? She asked, and the weight of that question was different from anything before, not about the past but the future, stripped of assumption, and when I turned slightly to meet her eyes I didn't search for anything, just saw her as she was in that moment, without context or justification. Now things move forward, I said, my voice steady, not harsh, not cold, just certain, because certainty was the only thing left intact. She shook her head faintly, like she was trying to slow something that had already passed. You're just going to walk out? She asked, a slight edge creeping in, not quite anger but close enough to recognize, and I nodded once, calm, without defense. Yes, I said, because leaving wasn't abandonment, it was recognition. And that difference didn't need explanation. She crossed her arms loosely, not defiant, just uncertain. And that's it, she pressed, still expecting something more, because endings aren't supposed to be this quiet, this controlled, this final, and I held her gaze for a moment before answering. That's everything that matters right now. Because anything else would come later, and none of it would change what had already been decided. The silence that followed no longer heavy or tense, just settled, like everything had found its place, and I opened the door, the cool night air meeting me in a way the house no longer could, stepping out onto the driveway that now felt entirely different, not because it had changed, but because I could feel her behind me still, standing in the doorway, no longer calling out, no longer trying to stop me, just watching, and I didn't turn back, not out of anger or stubbornness, but because there was nothing left to look for. I walked to my car, steady, unhurried, and when I reached it, I paused briefly, hand on the door. Looking at the house from a distance, lights still on, everything unchanged on the surface but entirely different in meaning, and there was no surge of emotion, no dramatic realization, just a quiet understanding that what I thought I was returning to had already ended long before I arrived. I opened the door, got in, started the engine, and pulled away without looking back, because some chapters don't need a final glance, only the decision to move forward. The road stretched ahead of me, quiet and nearly empty, streetlights passing in steady rhythm as I drove without music, without distraction, letting the silence settle into something steady, something I could think inside. And there's a moment after everything changes where you expect something dramatic, something overwhelming, but what I felt was simpler than that, clearer, like static finally cutting out. And I replayed the night not to analyze or search for what I missed, but just to observe it as it happened, the laughter through the window, the knock on the door, the look on her face when she realized I wasn't where she thought I was, and what stood out wasn't the betrayal itself but how predictable it had been once I stopped ignoring the signs. I hadn't been blindsided, I had been absent, and that difference mattered because it changed how I carried it forward, and by the time I reached the hotel, it looked the same as before. Neutral, functional, a place meant for passing through, which felt more fitting than the house I had left, and I parked, turned off the engine, and sat for a moment, not hesitating, just letting the shift complete itself. And inside the room everything was unchanged, the suitcase half unpacked, the jacket still on the chair, the low hum of the air conditioning filling the space, and I set my keys down, noticing how different that simple action felt in a place without history. And when my phone buzzed I already knew it was her, messages and a missed call waiting, the start of something trying to pull me back. But I didn't open them. I sat on the edge of the bed instead, looking at the screen and realizing the most important part of tonight wasn't what I saw, it was what I chose to do with it. Because reacting is easy, getting pulled into explanations and arguments is easy, but I had already made my decision before I knocked on that door. And everything after was just confirmation, so I set the phone down, leaned back, and let the quiet settle, and for the first time in a long time, there was no question left in my mind, just clarity, steady and undeniable, and I knew tomorrow would bring details, paperwork, conversations, but none of that would change what had already been decided, and as I looked around the room one last time, I understood that starting over didn't feel like losing something, it felt like removing something that no longer fit, and when I turned off the light and lay back in the dark, there was no anger left, no need to go back, just the quiet certainty that I had already stepped into what came next, and this time, I was fully present for it.